next speaker is Jamie Yakes. He's going to talk to you about 1929 Federal Reserve notes.
28.
Or 1928. And what we've got here is Jamie Yakes won a first place for a literary award from the Society of Paper Money Collectors. Hey. So we get how about that? Way to go.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Whose phone is that?
How many gold medals is that?
Gold medals is that?
Yeah.
2 I have.
Nice.
3, I lost one coming home from Memphis a few years ago. Along with all my luggage. Yeah, that was Delta. That was a pain in the ass, dude. You know what was the worst was I had an old leather belt that was like so soft you could whoop a baby's ass it wouldn't cry. You can't, you can't buy them that way. And I lost it. I could do nothing with it. So that sucked. But all right, Series 28 Fed Reserve notes. And my 10 years of going down to the archives, I've focused on 28s and 34s, the early small size. There's a shitload of stuff dealing with these notes right here. I mean, documents and documents and documents, and I've been so fortunate and had a lot of fun figuring this stuff out. I wish the same treasure load of documents existed for 34s, but they just kind of don't. So maybe one year I'll put together a nice presentation on those. So. A little trivia first. Now, Pete kind of skipped through this before, so if you weren't paying attention, you'll know the answer. But the only district issue notes for all 5 28 series. Okay, Atlanta. All right, good deal. It's Atlanta, right? This was one of the questions in the PCGS dinner the other night. I don't know if Laura put it up or not, so Well, I wanted to stump people, really, because if you say, what's the only district issue 28Ds? Oh, Atlanta, 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 right? Ask it in a different way and see how many people maybe do.
Or yeah, they're trying to convince me that wasn't the case. I'm like, I'm leaving the table.
Oh, crazy. All right, so series of 28 Fed Reserve notes. What are we looking at? We're looking at diversity. We're looking at complexity. That's 2 things that pretty much encompass all the different kinds of currency that anybody might talk about. Diversity, 12 districts, 9 denominations, 5 series, 2 district seals. 2 seal colors. Some people might argue there's a little bit of differences in there, but I'm arguing that that's the diversity. Complexity, we're talking Treasury officer signatures. Series lineages, numeral, letter seals, the gold clause, 28 Cs and Ds, and 28 D10s, which are not what you think. If you came to one of our presentations a few years ago, you'd know what I'm talking about. If not, I'll show you what I'm talking about right here. Denomination series pairings, basically, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4 different signature combinations, Tate Mellon, Woods Mills, and of course the scarce Woods Wooden. You notice a trend kind of creeping down on these is that as you go from 28 to 28D, they're making less denominations. Makes sense. By the time you get into 28C and D, it's 1932-33. Depressions hit. Although they're still pumping out FRNs because gold certificates have been pulled out of circulation, they're just not making that many plates for those later denominations. The BEP made a crap load of 28B plates. And I think they were just able to keep using those instead of going back and making new plates with woods and wooden signatures on them. Now, 28 FRNs were really just smaller 1914 FRNs. There's no law that was passed in 1928 that gave us the 28 FRNs, or any 28 series for that matter. They were just simply smaller. Top, bottom, okay? 1928 was the year that the BEP and the Treasury issued what they called reduced size currency. Small size currency, excuse me, let me just get this for a minute. Okay, the law was the 1914 Federal Reserve Act, created both these notes. When they decided they were going to change the size of the notes, all the designs came about in 1928, so that's where we get the 1928 series from. There's a reason why the 1928s actually look like the 1914s. Reduced size currency in the Treasury's mind came about in the 1900s when they had printed notes for the Philippines and realized that, hey, we made these things smaller. We got a lot more production out of the same effort making these reduced size currency notes for the Philippines. So things started circulating in there. Nothing really got moving until after World War I in the 1920s. But what you're really seeing with the 1914 notes that fully came about in the 1928 issues is a standardization of our currency designs. There is a reason why the 1914s look the same, because the Treasury had the intention of making the notes consistent. Going back, there was a huge number of different designs, not just per series, but per denomination. So that's what you're seeing with the 1914s. Come the end of World War I, 1923 or 24, I believe it was, the Treasury started to get in their mind that they were going to really now make all our currency consistent. That's where the series 1923 came from. That's kind of a more focused intent to standardize our currency designs. I believe it was 1925, the issue of reduced size currency comes back up. They say, hey, listen, we got to do something here. Basically, what they did was they went from producing 8 notes a sheet to producing 12 notes per sheet, increased their productivity 50% with basically little effort. They say same plates, same kind of machinery. I mean, any business is going to want to do that. You know, I had a physics professor tell me once, if you can create an engine with a 100% efficiency, you'd be the richest person in the world. Well, it's basically kind of what the BEP just did right here. So 1927 is when the machinations really started to get into, let's reduce this currency, let's make these things better. They could use the same printing presses, but they had to reconfigure the numbering presses, the trimming presses, all that for the small size. So we get the 28s coming out. They look the same, the portraits are slightly different. The 10s for the small size is Hamilton, I think he was, the 10s for large size was Jefferson or Jackson, I think Jackson, so they did change that. The other thing they changed mostly is they did change the seals. Different seals that you'll find on the large size and you'll find on the small size. So here's a 1914 seal, there's a 1928 seal, that's actually the second seal. Remember, it was a numeral to begin with. You can see really what they changed was they took this scalloping, spiking, whatever you want to call it, off the outside, and of course, since it was a smaller note, they had to get rid of a letter and number. And at first, they decided to get rid of the letter, keep the number, and then they switched to the letter. The Treasury seal, same thing. Obviously, these aren't to scale, so don't be thrown off. Really, it's the same seal. In the middle, they got rid of the scalloping that was present on the 1914s, and they made them spiked seals on the 1928s, going from there, all right? Now, when they originally came out, the notes had numerals in their seals. A lot of people say that they're a lot better looking than the lettered seals. There's people who go crazy, they love to buy them. I gotta say, I think they're a little sharper to see some of those numbers than to see some of those letters in there. What had happened was, when the BEP created the small size currency, if you look in the Fed Reserve Act, it doesn't really contradict itself, but it says the banks are identified by a number, but then the notes shall carry a letter and a distinct serial number. So when they reduced the small size currency, they decided to keep the number as a representation of the bank. But it started causing some problems. This is a letter from the New York Times. It's kind of hard to read, I apologize. This is how I got it off the web. But basically what it's saying is that people are starting to confuse certain denominations where the seal has a number that's also a denomination. So you're looking at a Kansas City 10 with a 5 and a, no wait, hold on, what am I doing here? See, I'm even getting confused myself, right? You got a Richmond 10, yeah, a Richmond 10 with a 5 in the seal. You got a Kansas City 5 with a 5 in the seal. All right, so as bank sorters are doing this, as tellers are whipping out notes, they may see this very prominent number and mistake it for a denomination and give it out to people, all right? I have about maybe 46-page of document of things going back and forth between bank officials, Treasury officials, BEP officials deciding what they want to do with this. A lot of it rested on what did the law say, because although it was at the discretion of the Secretary of Treasury to design the notes, the Fed Reserve Act gave him a little bit of direction and said you have to have certain things going on in there. Goes back and forth. They basically said, you know what, we can put a letter in there. There's nothing against it. And you're not going to confuse things. A very interesting vote came up that had to do with these little district identifiers. And they actually put a vote to all the governors of the 12 Fed Reserve Banks, said, what do you want to use, a letter, a number, or Roman numerals? Was one of the choices. And Roman numerals never came about. But what the BB decided to do was just change this numeral seal to a letter seal, okay? So you got the nice little one up at the top for Boston. They basically made it an A. They didn't change the size of the seals. They just went out and made brand new dies of each of these seals with letters on the inside. 28, okay? These were never issued. 500s, thousands, and above, I don't believe they ever issued them with the lettered seals, the numbers at the top. Now, part of the confusing thing that at least I was confused on when I started collecting was trying to wrap around my head how they name these series with all these different numbers and letter seals. And I actually borrowed this from Pete Huntoons. This is an article he published many, many years ago. And the key is this line right here. because one of the confusing things is if you look at a 28A 20, it's got a numeral in the seal, but if you look at a 28A 50, it's got a letter in the seal. And that's simply because when they decided to change the seal, they hadn't created any 1928A $50 plates. And so they just went ahead and they said, we're just going to make them numbered, lettered seals. They had already made a bunch of 5, 10s, and 20s, so when they made the change, they named those 28B. And so that's kind of why you get that weird dichotomy in there. That's the way the BEP works. You're going to see it again at the end of my slide. They focused on, they really looked at a series and a denomination when they decided how to name a currency. And if a denomination wasn't used, if a series wasn't used before on a class and denomination, they used it. 28 ones, that's why we get them. Because they never had a red seal 28 $1 note. They just named it 1928, although it was printed in 1933 when, 1928 C or D, $1 silver certificates were going out. So these are the signatures. When you get to the smaller denominations, they're both Woods Mellon because they didn't change the signature. It stayed the same. They simply just changed the district letter. Now, there was no overlapping. You won't find a 28A of any denomination with a letter and a number or any other series. There was a clean break. It just so happened what they had made before they decided to change. So that's what's going on here. This was something that I noticed on a couple proof plates. This is it happened on Boston. This is Dallas, right? This was the numeral seal plates. You can notice it's just 2 little matchsticks. But when they changed it on the numbered seal plates, they made it look more like a 1. I didn't find any documentation to say why, although I can simply just guess that they wanted to make it look more like a number now that they had letters in the seals. You'll also find it on Boston. Sometimes when you change things, unexpected things happen. This was an article I wrote a few years ago, but this is Dallas. And I was reading the article today to refresh myself, and I called this Kansas City throughout the article, and it's Dallas. But anyways, this is Dallas, and that's St. Louis. So you had these circling at the same time. I'm trying to think. I believe that when the BEP started making the lettered seal plates, they stopped using numbered seal plates for those denominations. But the notes were still circulating. They were still printing whatever they had. They didn't kind of just say, hey, we're going to get rid of all these numerals. They still used them, but they kind of stopped. So you had these things floating out. This was an interesting article from, I believe it was the Redemption Agency at the Treasury, where you had these notes coming in. People were basically confusing the 11 for an H because although it had this little crossbar, it was very skinny and thin. And when you're sitting there in a redemption chair or in the office and you're culling and you're going through thousands of notes a day, they relied on these markers to identify banks just without even thinking about it. So they were confusing the two. People thought they had a Dallas or maybe they thought they had a St. Louis. And what happened is on the H, they apparently strengthened that little crossbar. This I don't know if it's a new or old one because I had Pete pull me some proofs from the Smithsonian Institution. I couldn't tell the darn difference. But this was something unintended. You make a change, it gets out there, it's still creating confusion for people, and all they could really do is just wait for all these numeral seals to just be called out of circulation, and you had nothing but lettered seals. This is an interesting document. I'll be honest, I've been sitting on this for too many years. The BEP, when you're looking at the Treasury and the BEP, they didn't, take this with a grain of salt, they didn't really care that there were 28A, B, C series, so to speak. They looked at the laws. Okay, 28s were one group of notes, whether it was a 28, a B, a C, a D. 34s were the same thing. So they very often, for the 28s, didn't record the first serial numbers when they put a 28A plate to press or a 28B plate to press. They did for some of the Treasury currencies, silvers, and legals. They very often didn't for Fed Reserve notes. What this document is, it's actually a listing of not all the districts and not all the denominations, but the first deliveries of numbered seal notes for 5 10s, and there's some 50s and 100s in there. When I get around to it, I have all the serial numbering data by date for Fed Reserve notes. I know what was delivered by date. So it's just a matter of identifying that delivery that presumably is going to be all numbered, all lettered seals, because they're not going to mix the plates. So once you find that one delivery, it's all going to be lettered seals. I've come pretty close for San Francisco 5s because there's only 4 deliveries in question, but I've peeked at some of these other ones, and some of them there's like a dozen, 13, 14. And it's not that I have the delivery, I got to find a note, and I got to match the note to it. But what's great here is we have some dates. This is stuff you don't often find anywhere. And like I said, when I get off my butt one day, I'll do some research into it and I'll get it out there. But what I would be able to do is identify for whatever districts are listed there, the very first 28. These are all going to be 28Bs or 28As if they're 50s or 100s. Basically, that first serial number for that district for that lettered seal note is what I'm going to be able to push out. And that's just going to basically make things better for everybody. Andrew Mellon's signature was changed just for production of Mellon wood plates. This was something, again, found a document floating in some file down in the National Archives. What happened was, let's see, we had Tate and Mellon. I'm trying to remember when when Woods became one of the officers. He submitted when Treasury officers took office, they submitted a signature that was written, and it was reduced. I'm sure you're going to talk about that this afternoon. Become the Pete's, he'll kind of show you how to do it. But they took a written signature and they somehow transferred it to a metal plate. They were able to get it onto a note. So they asked Mellon to submit a new signature on his own. Okay. Some of the differences here, you can notice the A, there's this little kind of flourish that goes up. The M is quite different. It's not connected to the E, and there's no tail on the N. All right, just something interesting. No varieties were created. There's no overlap. This is not a Fed Reserve note. These are probably 2 silver certificates because it happened with legals, silvers, Fed Reserve notes, and I believe gold certificates. It's just something interesting. This is the only instance I know of, I think in small size, where an officer has 2 different signatures on the notes. I think it happened in large size a couple times, but they're there. It's just something kind of interesting, wanted to pop on there. But it occurs in Fed Reserve notes, but there's no overlap. So if you have a 28, you're going to have the one Mellon signature. If you have a 28A, you're going to have the other one. Hamilton's portrait was redone in 1930 during printing of the 1928Bs. Now, as a researcher, this is the kind of stuff that, makes it feel like Christmas every day. This is going back a few years ago. Pete sends me an email with this transcribed letter. Alvin Hall was BP director, 1924 to 1954, something like that. I actually apologize, I don't know who Mr. Hope was. What Alvin's saying is, Mr. Hope must have somehow said, hey, listen, I noticed something different with these 10s. Writes a letter to Alvin Hall. Hall responds and says, listen, we changed the portrait of Hamilton on a 10, okay? It's not wearing as long as it should. In other words, it's not possible to get a large number of impressions from the plate made from the present master die. Now, an engraver sat there, physically engraved Hamilton onto a little die, was picked up onto a roll, and that was used to transfer it to a master die for 10s. That master die was transferred to a roll, and then they'd use that roll to make master plates, which had 12 subjects. I guess the original die for the 10 just probably wasn't sunk in very deep. So you can imagine that when you have a roll and the metal is raised on it, your design, it's just going to get smashed over time. So that's my guess what happened. So they said, we got to do something, we got to make a new die. So within the past few weeks, a roll was taken from the master die and a portrait laid down from this roll. The portrait was re-engraved by one of our best men. So they re-engraved the die all the way back to the start. Picked up a new roll, made a new master die, picked up another roll, and started making new master plates. Each plate will be so marked as to make a distinction between the new and old portrait. On plates bearing the new portrait, it is planned to add a line in the ornamental engraving surrounding the numeral in the upper right-hand corner. This mark of distinction I have noted with a pencil mark. Now, Hall's saying I've attached a face impression. We didn't have that, so we couldn't see it. So, of course, Pete ends the email that says, find me this secret mark, right? My eyes are younger, so he wants me to look for it. Old, new. I can't really tell if there's much of a difference. This appears darker than that one. These, I believe I lifted from, I don't know if I lifted them from proofs. I think I lifted them from notes, so it could be the scan. But whatever change was made, it's very, very subtle. And probably only an engraver's eye can really tell the difference. So how do you find a mark when you don't know where it is? And you have all these little lines, and it could be anywhere on the darn note, right? The top one is old, the bottom one's new. Some of you may know where it is. I'm not going to talk again until we find it. I'm just kidding, really. But so what do I do? Well, you know, the good thing was we had a date in Hall's letter. So we knew that anything made after that date was probably going to be new portrait. Anything before was old portrait. So we could identify a couple different plates. So what I literally did, 2 notes like this. I went to work one day and I blew them up as large as I could fit them on an 8x11 sheet of paper. Like I took this 10 and I just made it huge. And sat there with what I knew was an old plate and what I thought was a new plate. And I had a marker. And I literally traced this line and then I traced that line on the old thing. And I kept doing that until finally I'd marked one line and on the other copy I wouldn't have that line. And it took me a few tries. So there's a bunch of emails going back. We had to, trial and error. We had to figure out a couple different plates and try to find out where things were going. So I finally found the mark. And it's this. This is the old portrait. This is a 10, face 37. That's a $10 28B, face 80 for New York. In the upper right-hand corner, there's this little flourish, whatever you want to call it. It's got this curve. All they literally did was just add a small line below the curve. All right. Once we found it, it became obvious. And it's actually obvious enough, if you're looking at Heritage, some of those auctions, you can find it. Now, luckily, we know the plates that were created. So we popped out the article a few years ago, and this really needs a reboot. Because what we didn't have was any information on the serial numbers for any of these varieties out there, okay? I'm trying to remember, but I think for the most part it was an even break. They started making new portraits. They stopped making old portraits, but I know that's not true for all districts. There were some instances where they still had a master plate floating around and they just went ahead and they made some new ones. But the column I want you to focus on is that column I've kind of highlighted there. Percent new used. You can see the actual, the original data here. Plates old new, used old new. And surprisingly, some scarcity, some not. But Chicago, you know, I started collecting New York FRNs, which are pretty darn common. But I got to be honest, Chicago just blows them out of the darn water. Well, now we have a variety that Chicago may actually be the scarcest one that's floating around out there. St. Louis, they made 52 new plates and they never used any of them. Not kind of surprising, St. Louis wasn't a heavily printed district. The BEP is just going to make the plates anyway, and if the Treasury or the Federal Reserve Banks never order any notes, they're never going to be used. The dates kind of become significant. This was 1930, I think it was what, May 1930 when the change was made. You'll notice those first sent to press dates are quite early, except for Philadelphia, March 8th, 1933. Here's a Chicago. This is an old portrait up at the top. This is a new portrait star. I think I just found this on Heritage when I was floating out there. Something significant is that you'll find both kinds of seals with these new portrait notes. You'll find yellow seals. You'll also find the what I call yellows, excuse me, light green seals, as most people know them. You'll also find the darker, the transitional green seals at the top. What I need to do for you guys is get in there and start looking at these plates and pulling some serial numbers and getting some serial numbers out and kind of doing a reboot on the article. It's great to get stuff out, but you got to push it out every now and then to get out there. But this was one of the funnest, most fun, right, things that I've ever done as a researcher. It's kind of nice, you know, and it's a visual thing out there. I guarantee lots of dealers aren't paying attention, so if you're a cherry picker, then you can go out and you can find what you want, put together a nice set of these. And it's just kind of something fun. All right, probably the most contentious thing that happens with some of these things. Dark green versus light green seals, the debate continues. You know, it's like Darth Vader and, you know, the Jedis and stuff like that. All right, okay. 28 FRNs, when they started printing the notes in 1928, they came with, I call it a forest green seal. Popularly, it's called a dark green seal, okay? It's this really, what I think is a really pretty, crispy, almost steelish kind of looking seal color to it, all right? They print those for a few years until sometime in early 1932, it could have been late 1931, you start to see this transition from a darker green, forest green, to, I don't know, hunter green or green bean green, whatever you want to call it, okay? Finally, in late 1932, August, October, definitely by 1933, what we have is this really gorgeous, pop in your eye, neon safety, yellow-green. Some people call them lime greens, whatever you want to say, okay? You can see the transition here. You can see how they just gradually get kind of lighter. If you're looking, these are popular. People love them. I like them. If you're looking for one, that's the color that you want. I'm not knocking the grading services, but they get it wrong. I know a friend, he's got a note, says it's yellow-green. It's not. It's a dark green. So you can't rely on them. You really have to rely on yourself. There are researchers out there, myself included, trying to nail down the serial number records to kind of get cutoffs in there. But that's what you want to see. Now, when you're looking at this, the distinctive difference, if you're not colorblind, of course, is that there's yellow in this seal, but there's really no yellow in the other seals going on there. I collected fives for about 10 years. It was my focus. And what I noticed was that for many districts on fives, yellow seals were pretty much non-existent. Atlanta, they're common. St. Louis, they're pretty common. There's a few others in there. I've just recently started collecting New York FRNs, so getting into 10s and 20s and noticing that yellow-green seals are a lot more common on those kinds of notes. As we're going to get into in a couple more slides, the yellow-green seals that are extant were impacted by the FDR's policies in the 1930s that ended 1928 notes. And I'll explain that. I'll show you some data, what's going on. But actually, you know what? I'm going to fast forward for a bit. Okay. Sorry you can't read this very well. It's mimeographed, 1930s technology, and it's just it's a photo of mine. But this is a vault. This is an audit of the Federal Reserve Vault at the Treasury, 1939, of unissued 1928 notes. Every district, every denomination. It's listed by dollar amount. Okay. What is significant about this is that, let me just pop to this bottom number down there, 2.8, these are in thousands, so that's $2.8 billion worth of Fed Reserve notes never issued because they were printed, they were sitting there, 1933 rolls around, gold's taken out of circulation, these notes are backed by gold, BP starts printing 34s, and these just kind of hang around. I've taken this, I have a big spreadsheet, I plugged it in. The significant thing with these is that since they're still in the BEP, they're in serial number order from the last serial number printed back however many, this isn't dollars, but if you convert it to notes, you can backtrack on the serial numbers going. Okay, now going back to, where I want this go? Okay, going back to here, 5s, 10s, 20s, I didn't get into the higher denominations, but you'll see one thing that kind of sticks out is this, 10s. Basically 2% of all the 28 notes printed were not issued. If you look at the other denominations, you'll see significantly more were not issued. 5s, 15%, 50s and 100s, you get up to 30%. What is the significance of this? A lot of what you're looking at in these numbers here are those yellow-green seals that people love to look for. That very likely.
So this is like 28 ABCD.
This is 28. This is all series, you know, and this goes back to what I'm saying. They looked at it as 28 because that was the law was on. Yes, this is all the series. Sorry for not making that clear. All the series. So when those numbers not issued, what you're looking at are a lot of these yellow-green seals that were never released. People keep looking for them. They probably don't exist because they were sitting there and they were destroyed. And as I had said before, again, it's kind of hard to see, but when you look at 5, I know Atlanta, there was only about 6 million. St. Louis, they all were issued. Those are two very common yellow-green seal notes for 5s. 10s, Boston, New York, Richmond, Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, San Francisco, they issued all the notes. By issued, I mean they were released to a Fed Reserve Bank. Now, there's another factor here, which we'll get into, is that the Fed Reserve agents at the banks had the notes once they left this vault. They may have never issued them. But that data is very hard to find. You usually can't find it anywhere. But regardless, they get out there. So when you're looking for yellow-green seals, my theory is a lot of them don't exist because they were never issued out of the BEP's hands, and they were simply destroyed in 1946. And I vetted that by taking all of these values, converting them to notes known, backtracking on the serial numbers for every district and denomination, going through heritage and everything I could find, and vetting that the highest observed serial I found is lower than the serial that was the highest serial issued through the Treasury. Did that just make sense how I said it? Okay, good, because it's a tongue twister to me. So the data fits as we're moving on.
Are you positive that they tipped stuff to the Fed and they gave it to them in serial number order?
Yes, that I'm confident on. That stuff at the BEP, the Treasury BEP, the comptroller, issued things in serial number order. The Fed Reserve agents at the banks, they didn't have to. And I have documentation of agents and bank governors questioning that, and Treasury saying, you know what, we don't think they need to. We don't think they need to.
From a research standpoint, how hard is it to determine what was destroyed?
Well, fairly simple with this data here. Sorry, what do you mean?
You talked about stuff going to the Fed.
Yeah.
And not being issued. Possibly.
This is not issued.
Correct.
That's it.
Yeah, well, the point is,
Issued. Right.
the point is, this is what's in the Federal Reserve Vault.
Correct.
I mean, this is in the BEP vault.
Yeah.
This is perfect.
Yep.
But what went to the Fed, we don't have it.
Yes,
And could have came back.
it could have came back.
Is there a record of that?
Yeah, we got
Yeah.
the dollar.
Yes.
record.
I-
We don't know the serial story.
I have that. Wait a couple slides, but I have a question to your answer. An answer to your question. Sorry. I'm sorry. Yes, and stuff might have come back that is issued but still ready to be used. That side probably kept. These are, as Pete said, when the BEP made a note, they called it perfect, which means it was printed, ready to go out. This is wrapped, packaged, sealed, everything, just never ordered by the bank. They never went out. They're sitting there.
Be considered a destruction log?
No, this is just a vault audit. I've seen a few of these. It was probably an annual thing where they went through. And actually, this document had 29 FRBNs and 34 series as well. But the 34s were all issued, and the 29 FRBNs were actually issued too. But this was probably an annual thing that they kind of did. So that's what this is backtracking here. I guess what I'm saying is that you're looking for all these yellow-green seals and you can't find them. Well, there's a good reason why you can't. It's because they were never thrown out of the BEP. And that number we'll get into, $2.8 billion. So unanswered questions, I don't know why the ink color was changed. I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you that. And I don't know if the change was sudden or gradual.
Was there an issue with them getting some from France?
That was the theory with the 1914 seals, and that turned out not to be true either. I don't know. Was it a mixture? Was it a supply problem? Who knows? I've never found any documents floating around. I don't know if the change was sudden or gradual. This has an impact on what serial numbers we say. Yes, this is the perfect cutoff right here. So one day, I'll find this stuff hopefully and be able to give you guys an answer. So FDR's gold policies in 1933, 1934 spelled the end of 28 FRNs, all right? FDR, President Roosevelt, inaugurated president March 4th. Basically 3 actions during his tenure, his term. Actually, sorry, just even in the first year. I read a great book recently called FDR's First 100 Days. Can't remember the author, I apologize, but it was wonderful. And I went into a lot of the people playing here, went into some of these policies. I've only known about doing this research, man, but for as much as people might bitch and moan, he did a lot of work in 100 days. And I'll let you guys decide what our current president's doing now. I'm not a political man, so, let's not get into that. 3 actions during FDR's first year set the stage for the eventual demise of 20 FRNs. His gold confiscation order, which was you guys are familiar with that. Joint resolution, and of course the Gold Reserve Act. Gold confiscation order basically required everybody to turn in gold. There were some brief exceptions or some small exceptions, but essentially, we're not going to use gold as a circulating medium. Everybody's got to turn it in. The joint resolution, which happened a few months later, actually abrogated the gold clause. What this said was that if you had a contract, be it a piece of currency or a bond, that required payment in gold, the government didn't have to honor that anymore. Gold certificates were withdrawn. Fed Reserve notes were not. So even though they impacted Fed Reserve notes, there was no mass withdrawal of Fed Reserve notes. Actually, there was an increase in their issuance to make up for all the gold certificates coming out. But the problem was you had that gold clause on the notes. Something would have to be done about it. Gold Reserve Act of January 30th, 1934 terminates coinage of gold, requires withdrawal of all gold circulation, and mostly this, terminated redemption of any gold for any U.S. currency. And then, of course, ceded title to the Fed Reserve banks. We get the 1934 series gold notes, and they're floating around. So here's the gold clause. This is the clause on a 1928 FRN, all the series. Redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury, or gold and lawful money at any Fed Reserve bank. Now, when this confiscation policy came out, when the joint resolution came out abrogating the gold clause, they didn't withdraw these notes. You just weren't going to get any gold for them, okay? Because there is an outlet here, or lawful money. They'll pay you Fed Reserve. They'll pay. At the time, they pay U.S. notes, pay pretty much what they would give you. But something had to be done. They couldn't have these things floating around saying gold all over them, okay? So all these policies come out. BP stops printing 28 FRN faces on February 14th, 1934. So you can see they continue for a little while. The problem is they haven't yet decided what they're going to do about the new policies. The Fed Reserve banks still need notes. So they're continuing to print notes. The last delivery occurred almost a year and a half later, towards the end of 1935. And this is the last delivery, San Francisco 5s, however many notes that is, 1 point something, I don't know, a couple 100,000 notes. It's the last delivery of notes that was issued from the FRN. One of the problems that came out, you don't have to really read this whole thing, but I popped it in there and I kind of double guessed myself. One of the problems with the 28 FRNs was that the Fed Reserve banks ordered them and paid for them, essentially. So they needed them even though these policies came out. The BP didn't have any 34 plates made yet. They started making those in July 1934, started sending them to the press in September of 1934. Well, the banks, so the question now becomes, all right, we need to get notes out. They say gold on them. We don't want to get too many out because it's just stuff we're going to have to pull back in. The banks say, you know what? If you want to wait and give me 34s, that's fine. I don't want to pay for 28s for you guys. So, of course, you get this internal issue going on that anybody who works for any business knows that happens all the time. And basically what came down, Mariner S. Eccles was chairman of the board of federal governors, chairman of the board of governors for the Federal Reserve Bank in the 1930s, I think the 1940s too. And between him and Morgenthau, what they basically decided was that the banks weren't liable for any 1928 notes that weren't issued. It was the Treasury and it was Congress, and thus the Treasury, that changed the laws, making the notes invalid. So he basically said, you're off the hook. You know, we're going to tell the BP to stop issuing the notes at some point. We're going to give you 34s, and we're going to move on. Now, okay, sorry. So let me skip ahead. So sorry. So these are the 1934s. Began printing these on September 27th, 1934. This is a beautiful New York 2, second serial number. You can see the new clause in there. So the note's also now legal tender. It's another change that came out, but you notice there's no mention of gold in it. All right. There was no withdrawal of 28s. When they started issuing 34s, they would just naturally come in. They'd be pulled out of circulation by the redemption agencies until just none were left going on. Now, Craig, here's the answer to your question up before, okay? Destruction of obsolete 28 FRNs in 1946. The last delivery was made in 1935. You see this a lot. The BP just sits on stuff. The Treasury sits on stuff because they don't really know what to do with it. The laws change things, but they don't say what to do with everything you printed that was valid before the laws were changed. So in 1946 is when talk comes on. Morgenthau, was it Morgenthau? No, who was Snyder? I think it was Snyder who was Treasury. Finally signs off and says, you know what? Let's just get rid of these FRNs. Now, included in this whole destruction was any extant 1928 gold certificates and the 1933 $10 silver certificates too. So location, the Treasury, there's that 2.8 billion, okay? Reserve agents, there's that 1.3. So the reserve agents at the banks had another $1.3 billion worth of Fed Reserve notes that may have gotten into circulation. They came back to the Fed Reserve agents. They may be new notes issued from the BEP. That data is not spread out. All we have is that one number saying basically 1.3. All right, and then BEP incomplete. These are basically sheets that are not numbered. They're just faced, they're out there. So this 172,000 in the Treasury, Fed, and the Reserve agents. I'm not including incomplete because, like I said, they're not numbered. So it's 171,000. Total 28 series delivered, a little over 1 billion. So basically 16, almost 17% of all the FRNs printed were destroyed in 1946. All really because of a law that said we're not going to do this anymore. If you try to figure out how much money was spent to make these, it's probably a few million, tens of millions of dollars, taxpayers' money.
There is, however, no breakdown by districts or by denominations, is that correct?
No, that's that sheet I showed you, yes. Yes, at least what was in the vault at the BEP. We don't know what these guys have. And that was something, if you remember the whole FRBNs that were issued during World War II, we knew what was issued and not. The question was, what did the reserve agents held? We don't know. There's no documents for them listing by serial number, because I think at this time, they didn't have to issue in serial number. They just broke open and they sent out whatever they wanted to send out, whatever was the first one in there. So 17%, and going back to what I've said, at least as it impacts one variety, a lot of these are probably yellow-green seals. A lot of stars too. Your 28C San Francisco and Cleveland 5s that everybody looks for, they're included in here. They just went out the door. Okay, there's your 1934. All right, 28C and FRNs are scarce and cool. Okay, so everybody's familiar with these two. These actually are not really that scarce. I think at one point I had like 70 of these recorded. They're probably more condition rarities. Try to find a nice gem. Maybe you won't find one, but if you just want one, they're out there. All right, here's your nice 28D face here. However, what? Yeah? Oh, I mean, yeah, they're beautiful notes. The BP made a lot of plates. This is 28C5s, 28D5s, C10s, and C20s. You can see here, they made a whole bunch of plates. Now, what's going on here is that the signatures are changing. I'd have to go back many slides and remember, but Treasury officers take place. Changes take place. The BP just goes through the motions. They start making new plates, and they start making new plates. And so you can see for 10s, 28Cs, they made everything but Dallas and what am I missing in there? KC, Dallas, IJ. Minneapolis and Dallas were the only two districts that didn't make plates on. Even 28C5s, they pretty much made them. So they made a lot, 39, well, they used 23, 15, 38, 10. And they made a good amount. They made 24 plates, and they didn't use any. And now you can see what's used. Obviously, we all know the 28Cs that are out there. A couple of the 28C5s. I have Cleveland and San Francisco. No notes reported, and none were issued. So you can stop looking for them, kind of.
Somebody's got a 10, a 28C10 on Atlanta?
No, no, because those were also probably destroyed and sent out there. This, I think, is the only one not known, I think, is Atlanta. And I think it's, looking at the data I have, they probably were all sitting in the BEP vault and destroyed along with it. Yeah, and there's, sorry, so they made a lot of them, just didn't use a lot of them, all right? So here's a Cleveland. These are all proofs. That's all we have. So here's a Cleveland. Here's a San Francisco. If you really want one, I'll cut these out. I'll sell them to you for $10 a piece. I can make all the copies that I need, all right? I'll even draw numbers in there. My kids are pretty good with it. I got markers up the wazoo. You can do whatever you want, all right? Here's a 28C Atlanta. 28C, Kansas City. No, yes, Kansas City. Which I just actually had it. I didn't put it in here because we happen to be in Kansas City. Couple 20s, Boston, New York, Cleveland. It's a shame they make these things. They don't use them. It would be great if we were out there collecting them and everything, but they just don't exist. One slide I tried to get in here, but I didn't have a copy of it, was the couple, what's it in 2017? I guess 2 years ago, the 28C Chicago Star was discovered. It was an unknown star for these series. C Chicago Star. It was previously unknown. A 10, yeah. I think Treglia got it. It showed up in a stacks of Bowers. So I don't know. I think there's a few types of these that were issued that are still unknown. These I'm showing you were never printed. These are just proofs from the archives going on down there. Okay, 28D10s. What? Really? They created these things? No. All right. Here's a 28D $10 proof. All right. If you look at the clause, it's got a legal tender clause. It doesn't mention any redemption for gold. All right. What this is, okay, this is analogous to your 28E silver certificates that had Julian Morgenthau signatures on them, but a legal tender clause. Okay, this is kind of the same premise that was going on. It's even got same signatures, Julian Morgenthau. again, I apologize for the kind of crappy copy here, but here's submitted an approved model of the face of a $10 FRN to carry out the change in textual provisions, recently authorized by the Secretary. Heretofore FRNs basically carried a clause that said you can redeem me in gold. Now they just say legal tender, redemption for unlawful money. Okay. As there has been no change whatever in design of the note or in the expressed obligation to pay $10, Mr. Hall and I, and this is William Broughton, who was Public Debt Commissioner back in the day, had a lot of weight and say in currency matters. They proposed to retain the former series designation 1928 with the addition of the next following letter E to indicate a minor change, the designation accordingly being shown on the model. So with this letter, they're saying, hey, we're going to make this 28E. All right, so they go on, they push it through. This is Broughton again. You can see Alvin Hall. These are his initials down here. I don't know who Mr. Harlan was. Oliphant was, I believe, legal counsel of the Treasury back then. What's really nice is when you look at these things, it wasn't just the Secretary of the BEP who had their say. You had legal counsel. William Moran was head of the Secret Service back then when the Secret Service really was out to find counterfeiters and not protect the president. He had a lot of say going on in things. So basically, Broughton's telling these guys, hey, here's a die proof of a $10 note. Okay, it's the same thing you just saw. The model, when approved, showed the designation Series 1928E, but we've changed it to Series 1928D. Okay, the designation 28E was made up from the record, which showed that the designation Series 1928D, sometimes reading this stuff really gets kind of dry, was assigned when the die was changed for the signature W.H. Wooden. As no use of such changed die has been made, the former designation 28E has been canceled, and we're going to apply the present change 28D. What's happening here? Well, somebody looked at the record and saw that they had created 28D plates for 5s. So when they created this 10, they looked at it. Originally here, they said, we already have 28D, so we're going to name it 28E because it's the next series. It's a minor change. They backtracked and they said, well, you know what? Although we used 28D on 5s, we didn't use it for 10s. And so that's simply what they did. And then when you go back to those letters and those numeral seals, that's why you have 28As with 5, 10s, and 20s have a letter, but have a letter, but 50s have a number. Because the BEP looked at the denomination, what was the next series in line, and that's what they went to. They didn't try to keep things consistent so that you had different series going after. But that's why this is a 1928D, and it's not really a 1928E. And that's it. Yes, sir.
The catalog right in front of me of this stuff, I think, and there are in the, 28C, you've got a couple of districts. Atlanta's, let's see, or isn't the one, Atlanta is the only one known, but 2 other districts probably were actually printed and delivered, but then wound up getting destroyed in 46.
Yes, Cleveland and San Francisco.
I know on the stars, for basically the stars are more available in 28 plain than anything else, and they were used to replace spoiled notes in all these 28A,
yes.
28B, and whatnot.
Yes.
28C does exist on the 10 from Cleveland, at least.
Yeah, there are stars now.
It's ultra rare, however. And you've mentioned now, what's the new discovery? A $10 star from
Chicago. 28C. 28C from Chicago.
28C from where?
Chicago.
Chicago.
I believe it was auctioned in November 2015, I think.
Cleveland has been known for a while, but
Yes.
yeah, and rather expensive. There are people who collect these things seriously.
They get up there, yes.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah.
What about the 1928 500s that pop up with light green seals? Is there data on those? Was that part of your slide?
They're, you know, they do exist. They can exist. Because the thing is, they just kept using those plates. So you can't look at the 28. You just got to look at they only made one plate because they didn't print so many of the notes, but they continue to use them. So if they print them in 1929, they're going to get a darker seal. If they need 500s in 1933, they're going to grab the one plate they have.
But they're iffy. They're going to be more
They're probably going to be more transitional. Yes, because
I see those holders from the grading companies.
it's you got, you know, like I said, I don't. The best, if you really like them, like I love them, you got to learn how to tell. And when the last issue of the small size Scott and I had a pretty in-depth discussion on that. And I know people complain and think it's not perfect, but you really need a 28C. Like take a 28C, that's a yellow-green seal. If you have a B that matches it, because that's what people like. That's the premium people want to pay. Some people try to say, oh, let's create this transitional seal, and I just don't buy it. It's either yellow seal or it's dark seal.
Below XF, you've got environmental factors. You've
Oh,
got
there's a lot.
soiling,
Go on
that's
Heritage
color.
and look at Heritage scans,
Yeah.
and just the quality of their scans in the old days, it's not the best. And I've had notes where I've recorded as yellow green because that's what it looks like in the scan. But then, you know, when you finally see the note or a serial number printed before it, it's like a completely different color. So you just have to learn what they look for.
Now,
Yes, sir.
one rather interesting thing, the 500s and thousands were obviously not at the top priority when they changed all of this.
No.
I don't believe the 500s and thousands went into actual, or at least
No.
were delivered until around 1935. So for instance, in 1934, if they need some more 500 at the Federal Reserve, they would continue to release 28 type, well, they would be 28.
Yeah, that's why you have that overlap, because they didn't have all the number. They didn't have enough 34s, either plates made or notes printed. And the Federal Reserve Bank still needed notes, so that's why they kept kind of issuing.
And I guess there was no
28s.
problem here because the gold clause.
No, there was no problem. There was no problem.
So, matter of fact, it's on the note.
You're just not going to get it. They're going to laugh at you, you know. But they wanted to get them out.
Talk last year, it was, I concluded, based particularly on the top serial numbers, only about 30%.